All right, we're going to look at chapter 3. It's also chapter 17, just depending on which book we use, but it's the same amount of information, and you're going to learn about a few interesting people in our history. Now, why is this important? Well, the idea that the U.S. would take a role in the world and began around 1897 to 1901 with this guy right here, President McKinley. He ended up controlling Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Midway Islands, and the Samoan Islands. And this is an idea of an imperialism. You can see the flag that existed at that time, where the United States would actually control other parts of the world. You know, up until this point, we're just kind of circled in and looking at ourselves. We're able to take control of these areas because of new weapons. And then if we look as a comparison all the way down through President McKinley to Obama over 100 years of power, we kind of do the same thing. We're always looking for new weapons to protect ourselves and control others. We have the best military too. These are the countries that we're involved in today. We might not say that we're imperialistly controlling them, but we definitely are a part of their lives. And these three men are kind of, if we look back, where this kind of started. And you'll see these guys again in the next chapters. So first we have McKinley, and you notice the cartoon image that I have from there, Teddy Roosevelt, and then at 332 pounds, we have Taft, the heaviest president that we ever had. So, section 1 of your chapter, what we have is the imperialist vision, building support for imperialism, the economic and political domination of another nation over a weaker nation. A desire for new markets was one of these reasons. As a new country, the U.S. had to concentrate on itself before turning outside to new markets. Once it had moved towards controlling the land from sea to shining sea, that would be from our east coast to our west coast, it looked to other countries to control that had natural resources that we did not have. Some countries were completely taken over, while others became what is called a protectorate. The imperial power allowed the local rulers to stay in control and protect against rebellions and invasions. Now, why do we do this? Well, there's a feeling of superiority. During this time, the concept of Darwin's theory of evolution had been published in 1859. This concept expanded the idea of social Darwinism. So there was what they felt was scientific Darwinism to social Darwinism, where there is one power of human race greater than the other, which says that a group is superior to others. Some felt that English-speaking nations had superior character and should dominate the planet. So you can see a picture of Matthew Perry there, and Perry is admitted to the imperial presence. Perry showed impressive technology and weapons that impressed the Japanese. Expansion over the Pacific. Perry opens Japan. So Matthew Perry, no, not from the TV show Friends, went to Japan in steamships. In 1852, President Millard Fillmore, what a great name, Millard Fillmore, persuaded Japan to trade with the U.S. The weapons and technology made Japan consider opening trade with the United States because they were so very impressed with what we brought and saw, and they had been so cloistered and protected that they hadn't progressed with their technology the way we had. Annexing Hawaii, our 50th state was originally an independent nation under the leadership of King Kailakaua. I'm going to blow these names. And Queen Liliuokalani. It was a point between U.S. and Japan, and it gave us a way to refuel our ships to get the great distance across the Pacific Ocean. Americans began to settle in Hawaii and grow a thriving sugarcane industry. American planters began to gain power and wanted the Hawaiian Constitution changed. The Hawaiian monarchy taking steps to reduce American influence in the Hawaiian government. Hawaii served as a supply stop from trade ships traveling between China and the United States. The idea of this imperialist vision in Hawaii, if you look at this timeline kind of thing, Hawaii is located in an area between the U.S. and Japan, and it has good soil. Okay, so Americans began to plant sugar, and Hawaii began to gain monetary power with its sugar exports. Everybody loves sugar, makes everything better. In 1887, planters pressed King, that guy, into a new constitution that took away much of the authority of the monarchy. Okay, a few years later, the queen ascended to the throne, but she wanted a new constitution that would give her more power back. So the planters staged a coup to overthrow her with the help of the U.S. Marines. The American planters had to wait until McKinley left office because he kind of sympathized with the Hawaiians to have Hawaii annexed. And so the concepts of Section 1 overall, imperialism, economic and political domination of a strong nation over a weaker nation, Anglo-Saxons wanting things to be of the custom of the Anglos and languages, the U.S. becomes assertive in its foreign affairs. You could see Theodore Roosevelt is coming on the scene there shortly. And so our last slide from this particular section of the chapter says relations with Latin America. So this is where things get a little bit different. So we look to the South. Pan-Americanism is the idea that North, Central, and South America all working together. James Blaine, the Secretary of State in the 1880s, in case you don't know what that position is, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State for a while under Obama, wanted to increase trade between the countries and keep Europe out, because if we can monopolize this entire hemisphere, which is the Western Hemisphere, then that is good for the United States. This did not happen, but the modern organization of American states as a result of these efforts. Building a modern navy. So if you are going to spread yourself out from this isolated area in our hemisphere, you're going to need to get military people there, and so you're going to need good boats to do it. So look at that new boat over there to the right, which looks like an old boat at this point, but at that point it was a new boat. Building a modern navy, military of the seas, required better, stronger, faster ships and ports abroad to refuel and refill the ships. Coal was needed for these steamships, and thus ports to load more coal were needed as well. Alfred T. Mann wrote, Americans started needing resources from around the world, rubber, sugar, etc., and to trade with countries is great, but to control them is cheaper and better for costs. And again, you can see some of those places down there that we like to control. Americans began living in different parts of the world, but still wanted protection from the people, of those people in those countries, because they were afraid that as Americans they would be attacked. So the U.S. government strengthened its navy. They could travel to those parts of the world. Airplanes did not exist yet, so they were going to have to use the boats. So now we're in section 2. So now that the Kardashians have gone off to Cuba on their trip, taking Kanye West with them, I'm sure that you are all familiar with where Cuba exists. But you guys can see it is 90 miles to the south of Florida, if you're confused with your geography. A Cuban rebellion begins. 354 officers and sailors were on the Maine. 266 died. It could have been an internal problem in the ship, but many decided to blame Spain. No matter how the explosion happened, Cuba was a Spanish colony that made money on its sugarcane. 1/3 of its population was still enslaved. Can you believe that? By 1886, 20 years after the Civil War, Jose Marti, an exile poet-writer living in New York, brought together other Cuban exiles to raise money for Cuban independence. Plus, the U.S. and Cuba were tied economically. Money! So Marty launched a failed rebellion in 1895. But Americans supported the Cubans. Many Americans compared the fight of the Cuban rebels to that of the American Revolution. Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer had competing newspapers that would run headlines that played on American emotions. People did not have the internet, so they only had newspapers. They believed what was printed was truth and not sensational journalism known as yellow journalism. The Cubans did suffer at the hands of Spain, but these newspaper owners were trying to sell newspapers, not help these people. So you see George Dewey of the U.S. Navy, I took my fleet into Manila Bay. That's going to be later, because we are also going to go into the Philippines for this gig. So as you can see here, who is this William Randolph Hearst? Well, if you go up to Santa Barbara and you go north of there to San Simeon, he has what's called a castle. It is giant. I've been there a couple of times. And he was a newspaper man that invented the concept of yellow journalism. Here's President McKinley. Americans supported Cuba's fight for independence against Spain, and because Americans lived in Cuba, I sent the USS Maine to Havana. And the Maine exploded, and I blamed the Spanish, and the U.S. fought in the Caribbean and the Philippines. So there was a calling for war in 1897. McKinley becomes president. He was the last president who had fought in the Civil War and hated the carnage of what he saw. He helped in negotiations between Spain and Cuban rebels. Spain wanted to allow Cuba self-rule, but under the Spanish government, Cuban rebels refused, which made Cuban loyalists, which are friends of Spain, angry. Now, with Cubans fighting, Cubans in Spain wanted control. McKinley sent the USS Maine, which exploded in the harbor. So, Americans blamed Spain, though it is still not known if it blew up as a result of that or an internal problem. Jingoism was a term applied by the Republicans regarding the attitude of aggressive nationalism. So the concept of really supporting the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican and the Secretary of the Navy, wanted war with war, or the Republicans might not win the next election. McKinley asked Congress to use force in Cuba. The Americans declared Cuba independent, which caused Spain to declare war on the U.S. It's nice that we could say the U.S. or us. Okay, so we had a war on two fronts at this point because the Spanish controlled the Philippine Islands. And so that's why in the Philippines to this day, Spanish is spoken, and there are also many Filipinos with Spanish-sounding names. So the Philippines was another colony of Spain. The U.S. Navy was in the Pacific in Hong Kong. The Americans did not want to allow Spain to attack the U.S. in California, our west side. So Commodore George Dewey went to Manila. In the early morning hours, the Americans destroyed the Spanish fleet. Like, they were not expecting it to be so quick. President McKinley was not prepared for this, and he didn't know what to do with the Philippine victory. While in the area, the Americans decided to capture Guam as well. Forces battle in Cuba. The American army in Cuba was not as efficient as the Navy in the Philippines. The climate of Cuba there was terrible conditions, disease, and lack of supplies and resources. More Americans died in camps than during battle. We see this a lot in war. You get one injury, you die of gangrene. You spread the diseases through the area. People are defecating and urinating, which spreads diseases everywhere. If it's not taken care of, the body's rotting, bring about diseases, etc., etc. During this time, the group of men assembled into volunteer cavalry called the Rough Riders. And why is that important? Because our next president was a Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt. But right now you can see a glimpse of the world, and you can see exactly these areas in red and some in black, including Cuba, that the United States decided to control as a result of this Spanish-American War. So this is the last slide of this section. An American empire is born almost by accident in some respects. It's not like they were going out and doing it initially, but I guess as a result of Americans moving, it kind of fell in their lap. So the victory in the Spanish-American War allowed the U.S. to expand its holdings in the South Pacific and control Puerto Rico and Cuba. So there's an idea of a debate over annexation. The action of occupying another country is annexation. So you guys kind of think about this. Did the U.S. now have the right to control these other countries simply because they won this war? It was an easy defeat. Many Americans at the time thought that controlling these countries made the U.S. an occupier over other people. Others felt it was the duty to help these underprivileged nations. So these underprivileged nations, are we helping them or controlling them? So, as you can see there, John Hay called this a splendid little war. I, McKinley, am enjoying the power of taking over other countries, leaving them with U.S. officials to watch over them. The Spanish-American War only lasted 100 days and cost the U.S. almost nothing in casualties, yet brought many other countries under the control of the U.S. That's why it's a splendid little war. World War I would be fought 20 years later and killed 37 million people as compared to what happened in this particular war. Rebellion in the Philippines. There were people that objected to the U.S. controlling other countries. Emilio Aguinaldo was a Filipino, was one of those people. Americans set up conditions in the Philippines that had complained about in Cuba, against Spain. President Taft wanted the Filipino people to favor the U.S., so he made changes to education and healthcare, hoping that would do that. In Puerto Rico, the Four-Acre Act said Puerto Ricans were not U.S. citizens, and still aren't to this day, by the way, either in Guam or American Samoa, but that the U.S. had the right to govern the islands. Eventually, the U.S. allowed them to elect their own officials. So, Cuba, the Platt Amendment, which is a question. Senator Orville Platt wrote it. It was a permanent treaty, it should say, with Cuba and the U.S. First, Cuba cannot make a treaty with any other nation. Second, Cuba had to allow the U.S. to buy or lease naval stations in Cuba. Guantanamo Bay is one of those places that still exists. Remember, that was Obama made a promise to close that down. Of course, that didn't happen, but Cuba had to keep a low debt, and the U.S. would intervene to protect Cuban independence. This amendment was added to the Cuban Constitution. And, of course, things changed. So when we think presidential assassination, usually your brain's going to go straight to Abraham Lincoln or, of course, JFK, John F. Kennedy. But believe it or not, here we have a guy that was also assassinated. He was the 5'7", 233-pound President McKinley. He was assassinated, but would have survived if the bullets had been found and removed. So September 6, 1901, one man in the crowd, and there's his name, hoped to assassinate McKinley. He concealed his gun in a handkerchief, and when he reached the head of the line, shot McKinley twice in the abdomen. Unknown to the doctors, the gangrene that would kill him was growing on the walls of his stomach, slowly poisoning his blood, and he died September 13th, which was 6 days later. You can see him on the $500 bill if you're ever lucky enough to see one. I have not. His vice president took over. And who was that vice president? The very charismatic Theodore Roosevelt, soon to be called Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt is just this amazing guy. And so he rises to power. He was famous before he was president because of the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War. In the election of 1900, McKinley beat William Jennings Bryan, but was assassinated months after taking office. It was his second term. So Teddy Roosevelt became president at only 42, the youngest president so far. He was not elected youngest, but he was the youngest to take the office. Roosevelt becomes president. He was born sickly as a child from rich parents in New York, but pushed himself to be more fit and was a great shooter and horseman, which was really important at that time. He really pushed for America to be strong in world politics and not sit in our hemisphere uninvolved. American diplomacy in Asia. By 1899, just before Roosevelt's presidency, the U.S. had become a strong naval power in the Pacific. The U.S. wanted commerce, which is trade, in the area to make money, not enemies. Okay? Money, money, money. The open door policy is a policy proposed to keep China open to trade with all countries on an equal basis, keeping any one power from total control of the country, basically the Russians, and calling upon all powers with their spheres of influence to refrain from interfering in any treaty port. But Russia feared Japan's increasing power, and Russia wanted to limit Japan's invasion of the mainland China. With the policy, it reserved equal training opportunities in China for all foreign nations. So all of these people kind of going all over the world and getting into other people's affairs does cause rebellions, because those people living in those areas don't necessarily like other people coming into their neighborhood and messing with them. And one of these was the Boxer Rebellion, pretty famous one, and you could get its name from the translation of the Chinese word, which kind of sounded like boxer apparently. A rebellion in China against foreign involvement in China. The Chinese had resisted modernization, but the world caught up with them. European and Japanese imperialists were starting to carve out a presence in China. Carving out would be painful if you thought about it. Why is it called a boxer? A secret organization led by an empress that wanted to get rid of foreigners and the Christian religion. Their name translated, Righteous Harmonious Fists, fist sounds like a boxer. These people attacked the foreign embassies, killing 200 people. John Hay kept the peace and trade, and John Hay was the Secretary of State, if you recall. So you see his picture there. We're not involved in China as well. We simply wanted to open trade and not war. So what Teddy Roosevelt did with this idea of, he will get the idea of speak softly and carry a big stick, would be to send the Great White Fleet, the U.S. Navy, around the world to show its strength. So he says, I believe in showing a strong American force. I was also able to form peace agreement between Russia and Japan over China. I did this in Connecticut at a meeting and won the Nobel Peace Prize for my effort. Only president to win the Nobel Peace Prize at that point. Balancing power in East Asia. After the peace agreement was made, Japan continued to involve itself against the terms of the treaty. So that's why Teddy Roosevelt sent his. Okay, guys, the growing presence in the Caribbean. Theodore Roosevelt pushed for the building of the Panama Canal, a shortcut through Central America for boats to pass through. It would shorten the trip by 8,000 miles. The Panama Canal itself, shipping goods by boat from one coast of the U.S. to the other faster, would increase American power by increasing commerce, that's, trade and money, by tying both sides of the U.S. together, just as the railroad had done. Also, the pass at the bottom of South America was actually quite dangerous for boats, and they could wreck very easily. The country, Colombia, was paid $10 million for the purchase of this area and $250,000 a year in rent so that the U.S. could start the building of the Panama Canal. The revolt in Panama. In November of 1903, Panamanians, led by that guy, a French agent, rose up to fight against Colombian rule. So when that happened, the U.S. decided to hurriedly recognize Panamanian independence, which would then allow them to form a peace agreement or a treaty with Panama in order to get construction started. So the Roosevelt corollary: speak softly, carry a big stick. Roosevelt described his style of foreign policy as the exercise of intelligent forethought and of decisive action sufficiently far in advance of any likely crisis. The idea of negotiating peacefully, simultaneously threatening with a big stick or military. And so you can see that that was a picture down at the bottom. He would try to be peaceful, but say, hey, look at these 5 guys behind me that are willing to beat you up if you don't do exactly what I say. The corollary was a speech given by Roosevelt to Congress about the Monroe Doctrine to prevent European countries from entering the Western Hemisphere, that is the hemisphere you live in, and involving themselves in the affairs of countries there. The new President Taft, the big guy to the right that weighed 332 pounds, wanted to substitute dollars for bullets and not have a big attacking warful presence, but still had to use bullets in a place called Nicaragua, which is found in Central America. So, kind of the end of this chapter, and here is a bit of a conclusion. What should you take away from this lesson? Even the U.S. engaged in imperial activities in controlling other countries, okay? During McKinley's presidency, the Spanish-American War occurred, and the U.S. ended up controlling Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and he, of course, that guy there to the left, became a hero, and we still control those countries to this day. Teddy Roosevelt, became president after the assassination of McKinley and began building the Panama Canal. I also moved the U.S. further into a place of world dominance with my big stick policy of diplomacy. Little Taft over here, the biggest president ever. Try to remember that I did my best to keep peace with my dollar diplomacy in our hemisphere. And you guys can see some other things. And finally, let's review these presidents again in our finale. Conclusion review. We, of course, have McKinley, and we then have Teddy Roosevelt, and we have Mr. Taft. The 5th president was from Ohio. Roosevelt witnessed Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession, and then, of course, Taft. He actually had, Taft was the heaviest president once he got stuck in the White House bathtub and required 6 aides to pull him free. After that, the tub was replaced with a new one, large enough to hold 4 men, including one Howard Taft.